Morning, everybody. We're delighted, as usual, to welcome you to our final week of the Pandemic Times class. This week, we'll be thinking about globalization and how our interconnected global community has been affected by and how that interconnection affects our experience of the pandemic. And I'm happy to introduce you to our faculty for today. Dr. Amanda Petersen, who's been with us all as one of our co-directors. She's going to be talking about narratives of dystopian contagion on the US-Mexico border. Dr. Kate DeConinck from Theology and Religious Studies will be talking about Catholic responses to pandemics. Dr. Vidya Nadkarni will be talking about pandemics and global governance. And Dr. A Baillie will be talking about public health and development. And so, just to begin, I'd like to ask each of our faculty speakers for today to introduce themselves and say a couple of words about their academic discipline and the kinds of questions that they ask. So, Dr. Petersen.
So I do several different things in one. I am a cultural and literary professor, which means I'm interested in signs, metaphors, symbols, and critical analysis of lots of things, not including literary text, but not only literary text. So I look at images, I look at all different kinds of discourse, and then I focus on gender studies. So that means I'm really interested in gender dynamics and gender equities and how gender identities impact all of these phenomena that I study and how they also impact representation. So finally, I'm a Latin Americanist with a focus on Mexico. So that means when I look at things, I always start from a decolonizing point of view. So I look at power dynamics and how often those power dynamics are legacies of colonial realities.
So my name is Kate DeConinck. I teach in Theology and Religious Studies. You heard from Dr. Calloway a few weeks ago, who's also in my same discipline, but we actually have very different training within our same field. So I'm trained in the anthropology and the history of religion, which means that I look at how beliefs and practices come to life for individuals and communities in complicated ways, kind of in everyday situations, both historically and in today's world. So I'm really interested in processes of meaning making and how people use religion as a tool to navigate conundrums and questions and difficulties in their own lives. So the sorts of things that I study are centered around religion after mass tragedy. So I did a project on religion after 9/11. I've done projects about Sandy Hook shootings and other kind of related catastrophes and how religious communities have drawn from their beliefs and their practices to find meaning there. So I'm excited to be here with all of you today.
My name is Vidya, Nadkarni, and my academic discipline is political science. My particular expertise is in international relations, which is a subfield of the discipline of political science. And my work in particular looks at the strategies that emerging powers and rising powers, particularly India, Russia, and China, are using in ways to displace, replace the dominant hegemony of the United States in world politics.
Yes, so I'm actually in the engineering school, Shiley-Marcos Engineering School, and I am a materials engineer. So I work with recycling plastics, but materials engineers work with all kinds of materials that you make anything from. And I'm going to be looking at the intersection of engineering, health, and development from an engineering perspective. So how is it that we create all of the structures and infrastructures and things that we make and build and do and eat from, and how that affects our health and our development practices. And I work through the lens of social justice, social and environmental justice.
Okay, let's turn it over to Dr. Petersen.
I'm going to talk about narratives of dystopian contagion. I promise it won't be awful. It won't be super sad. But so my research often has to do with ghosts, and it's often talking about ghosts as a metaphor. And I would like to describe it today kind of as the ghost archive. So the ghost archive is the archive of history, of narrative, of testimonies that are things that don't get written or talked about in the everyday dominant discourse. So we could even talk about the hegemonic discourse of dominant cultures and dominant societies. So what are the things that get erased or silenced or violently oppressed? And I often am looking at this from the point of view of gender violence and the murder of women in Latin America and the US, but in particular in Mexico. So one of the things that a quote that I thought was really interesting from Carlos Monsiváis, who was an essayist and cultural commentator, he talked about how we all live in apocalyptic times, because basically we are walking in the footsteps of apocalyptic moments that we never remember. So a pandemic is a perfect example of that. We talk about this being unprecedented and that we've never experienced that. But the reality is not only in our lifetimes have there been other pandemics, but also the entire history of human experience is marked and punctuated by pandemics. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give us some kind of examples of apocalyptic moments and their representation in art and literature, talk a little bit about pandemics of the past and kind of the stories that were told about that, talk about contagion narratives, and a little bit about speculative fiction. So when we talk about pandemics, and the pandemics have to do with the ghostly archive, right? So we've forgotten about them until all of a sudden we're living in the middle of one, right? And we think that this is the first time that humans have experienced this. And one of the things that we really have been talking about in different kind of ways is that even though a microbe does not distinguish against different humans, the way that it impacts humans and creates and shows us how society is unequal, how we have poor economic and health conditions that impact the way that microbes impact different humans, is one of the things that pandemics do as a cultural phenomenon, because they bring to light things that we don't usually talk about. So they bring to the surface that which is not always at the forefront in the collective consciousness. Now, again, those of us who study these kind of things, we know that this is always there, and we are always thinking about these things, but it brings it forth in a way into our public consciousness that is not always there. So let's look at the etymology of the word pandemic for a second. It comes from the word Greek. The pan means common, all, demic means people. So if we talk about a pandemic of racism or of white supremacy, it's referring to an ill that is global and widespread. So that the pandemic of racism or white supremacy makes complete sense when you're talking about it in this kind of metaphorical and literary way. So one of the questions that I kind of want us to think about are, what are the ghosts, or what are the stories that we will tell about this particular pandemic, and how will we write this narrative? So we heard from Professor Wald in our homework and the 20-minute recording you saw of her, that pandemics bring to the forefront all these inequities that are always present but often ignored. So it makes complete sense that we have been having protests against police brutality and white supremacy and racism in our society in a moment like this, because of what the function of pandemics do, and they bring to light really important things. So famously, when we're talking about utopian fiction, a utopia often comes at the cost of something horrific, like some innocent. Like one of Ursula Le Guin's famous utopian fictions is that the narrator discovers that the reason why they're able to live in utopia is because a child suffers alone in horrific ways so that the utopia can be maintained. So one of the questions that it brings, this like quintessential question of a utopian narrative is this utopia worth that cost? And does the narrator or the protagonist want to try and create a less dystopian future for everyone? So some of the things that I've been thinking about are, what are the ghostly stories we will tell? What are the ghostly stories we want to tell? What are the narratives that we want to have written in this moment of pandemic? So have you had a moment, either during these pandemic days or in the days before, that your world just kind of suddenly and irreversibly changed in an instant? So maybe it's like the sensation that time stopped in a way that took away your breath for a split second. Maybe you felt that way when we all started to shelter in place. Or when you heard you weren't going to have graduation, or maybe last week when President Harris said we won't be starting off in person. Or maybe it was when you saw a white man stab at the neck of a black man for 8 minutes and 42 seconds. Maybe you just had this thought, this might be the end of the world as I know it. And you don't necessarily think, oh, and I'm going to be fine. You think, what will the future bring? So I know that I'm not alone in being kind of compelled to read Contagion and apocalyptic narratives at this time, because, well, in part I'm a literature professor, so what am I going to do except for like immerse myself into these narratives? But there's a way in which like it shows us the resiliency of humans and the way in which other people and other generations in fictional or literal ways have gone through things like this before. So this artist, Carlos A. Morales, does a really fascinating thing with his installations. You'll see that this looks like it's a museum. It's the symbol of utmost like culture and civilization. And he brings in moths, which in Spanish are called mariposas nocturnas, which often, or polillas, but often mariposas nocturnas are night butterflies. And there is lots of folklore about how they're omens of death or ending or of new change. So he creates these kind of like eerie installations in which we are all immersed in, and I have had the pleasure of seeing a couple of these installations, and it is really kind of all encompassing. You'll know that you'll see that they're at the top and at the bottom. And this artist, what he wanted to do is he wanted to create this moment, and that you kind of feel that apocalyptic instance. So I want to talk just a little bit about pandemics and imageries from the past and future. So as a Latin Americanist, and as someone who studies Mexico, it's impossible to not think of the conquest and the disease that were brought by the conquistadores when they came. So it's said that during the 1520 smallpox infection, something like 1/3 of the population died from disease. And there's a quote from one of these colonial texts that talks about when the quote is, when the Christians were tired of war, God saw it fit to send the Indians smallpox, and there was great pestilence in the city. So the Spaniards saw it clearly as a punishment from God, and also as a way to justify what they were doing by conquering these peoples. The Mexica, which are, that's usually the proper name, they were newcomers for the disease, right? And curiously, the Spanish were saying this is God's punishment, and the Mexica knew that it had come from the outsiders. So they say about 1/3 of the population died. Be careful here, though, because one of the things that sometimes you will hear was that, honestly, the Spaniards weren't that violent. They didn't kill that many people. It was really, they had so much help from disease. And while that is true, this does not diminish the cruel violence that was at play during the conquest. One of the reasons that we know this is recently in the last 20 years, we've done DNA studies of people who have indigenous DNA, and we know that the majority of that DNA was brought by the maternal line, which speaks to rape and pillaging of women during the conquest by Spanish conquistadores. So there's something just uncannily and familiar about these images, having lived the last months that we have. So we have the Virgin of Guadalupe and a bubonic plague of 1743 outbreak. And then we also have the Spanish flu here in 1918. The Spanish flu, by the way, we know that it was actually started in Kansas. It wasn't, I'm from Kansas, by the way. It really is, it was identified about 20 minutes away from where I was born, actually. But we've seen these images, right? This is from 1918, but these are things that are familiar in this kind of haunting way that it wasn't before. So let's talk for a minute about what the contagion narrative is. And Dr. Wald, in her research, she's a cultural and literary critic as well. And so she looks at what is the outbreak narrative? What are the stories that we tell about pandemics? So she says the microbe might be novel, but the story is very old. It's not new, right? And one of the things she really emphasizes is how contagion is analog for being human, how contagion and spread of disease it symbolizes and shows us the interconnectedness of our human experience. We are social beings. We depend on each other to be responsible so that we can take care of one another, but also be social and reach out to one another without posing dangers. Well, we pose dangers to ourselves, to the human condition, just by our being social. So she talks about how it's really important when we are focusing just on microbial warfare, it ignores the human responsibility. It denies the fact that humans are responsible for making pandemics, right? So if we only focus on the microbe, it's super easy to stigmatize contagion by closing borders, by being xenophobic, by calling it the China virus, and then there's racist violence that happens against people like that, or like typhoid. Mary is a perfect example of that. She was an Irish immigrant who cooked because she could make more money doing that. And there was no option for her to maybe make as much money without spreading disease. And her story is very interesting, by the way. It's interesting to read about her. So when we're focusing solely on just some sort of technology that could solve this issue for us, and this is not to be anti-vaccine or anti-science or to deny the technological advances or progress that can help us solve issues like this. But if we fail to see the interconnectivity of our relationship with nature, among each other, our interglobal dependence and responsibility, then we're failing to see the message and get the message of the contagion narrative. So let's talk for a minute about what speculative fiction is. So in the past, we talked about speculative fiction kind of like a sci-fi or utopian or dystopian, but it's kind of a broad genre that talks about all literary genres, like film, TV, comic, graphic novel, literary narratives. It's been very popular lately. I'm sure most of you have seen things like Game of Thrones, or even like Stranger Things has an element of this, because it's kind of a little bit utopian, a little bit dystopian. Sometimes there's apocalyptic moments. Sometimes it involves like magic or the surreal. And oftentimes it talks about environmental collapse or science fiction. These kind of narratives are perfect playing grounds for calling to attention the inequities and power dynamics of society. So I'm often really interested in gender, and so like narratives of confinement often are excellent playgrounds to be able to talk about contagion, gender inequities, domestic violence, and dystopia. So let's talk just a minute about the apocalyptic imagery that we have seen in our 2020. So I think about all of these mass graves being built in different countries, from Hart Island outside of New York City, from Tijuana that's just starting over to the south, or in Brazil. And I think about also all of the news that has showed us how the virus has been impacting us globally and also in a way that's unequal. So I'm focusing kind of on border in California and essential workers in California. So the border travel starts to be impacted for daily life because we're controlling it. US factories are still open, but workers start to die. US border factories, so US factories on the border are pressured to stay open despite the risks. California fails to protect Latino workers as virus ravages through communities of color. Despite judges' orders, migrant children remain despite COVID outbreaks. And then this county knew that the farm workers could be affected, but why didn't they stop it? So let's see. Okay, I'm looking at my time. So I want to just show you a couple examples of how fictions can do this. So this is a sci-fi movie called Sleep Dealer. It talks about how the border is extremely militarized to the point that workers can't cross. And you see kind of haunting way workers doing repetitive actions with no machines. And so it emphasizes the human impact of labor instead of ignoring it. I'm going to do these kind of quickly. So this is also a gendered labor condition. Border, it's women who do repetitive action to create the objects that they hold. This is not actually a sci-fi movie, but there are dystopian moments when it talks about the impact of the environment, how their children are living in the waste that factories have, and their particular health impacts from making these small objects. These are just a couple images. So this is the border wall. This was a few years ago, but I just want to show you the expanse of factories, most of them US owned, internationally owned. This would be this by Mexicali. This used to be mostly kind of ranch and open space. And then don't let us forget that when we're talking about pandemics and zoonotic diseases, the impact that we have on nature and how we invade it and how we treat it and how we take care of it is crucial in times of pandemic. To end, the question that I want to ask is taken from Charles Wu. So Charles Yu. He writes speculative fiction, and he asked us to kind of consider, was the real illusion the fiction that we lived before the pandemic, and now we're just waking up to reality, or is something else occurring?
So the topic for my presentation today is thinking about Catholic responses to pandemics. And we're going to do a kind of comparative case study between looking at the conditions of Catholic responses during the time of the Black Death or the Black Plague compared to the COVID situation that we see in our world today. So just a little framing before we get started. You heard from Dr. Calloway a few weeks ago about this idea of theodicy, right? This idea of in times of great suffering, people have questions about what is the nature of God. People have questions about why is there such extreme suffering if there is a benevolent and a good kind of deity that exists. So, he gave you a great presentation thinking about the plague and thinking about Camus' work in that context. What I want to talk to you about today is more centered around interpersonal relationships and this idea that you see cutting across all of our presentations today of collective responsibility. So I want to think about how do religious practitioners think about their relationships with and their obligations to other human beings during times of pandemics. So again, we're going to look at these two cases, the Black Death and the COVID situation today, and really emphasizing the kind of overall point here is as we look at the Catholic response to both of these situations, we see that in both cases, Catholics are actually very concerned with upholding this idea of collective responsibility and the ethical relationships that we feel and have with other people. But based on the conditions and the beliefs that are in play at each moment in time, what that collective responsibility looks like is radically different. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff that we could talk about in relation to both of these case studies. But for our purposes today, what I want to share with you is, let me fix this for you. Okay. What I want to share with you is two kind of main themes that we'll think through. So we'll start off by talking about the situation with the Black Death. And in both cases, I want to look at the role of the sacraments and then the role of imagined community. Okay, so when we talk about the Catholic sacraments, what we're talking about are the rites and the rituals that are really at the core of the Catholic tradition. Catholics have 7 primary sacraments or rituals that are important in their daily and kind of lifespan, their lives and their lifespan. So baptism, Holy Communion, marriage, these are examples of some of the sacraments. And we're going to talk just about a few of the ways that Catholics draw upon the sacraments during times of pandemic. So the question to think about here is, what can Catholics' use of the sacraments during each pandemic teach us about their beliefs, their priorities, and their sense of collective responsibility? Okay. The second theme that I want us to kind of think about is this idea of imagined community. So the concept or the idea of imagined community goes back to the 1980s to a scholar named Benedict Anderson. And Anderson is writing about the theme of nationalism. And he's really trying to understand how is it that people come to feel a sense of solidarity as a nation, even though a nation isn't something that we can kind of feel or touch or directly encounter, right? It's partly imagined by us. So kind of drawing from Anderson's way of thinking, I want to think about where Catholics tend to draw lines of communal inclusion and exclusion during times of pandemic. So with whom do they feel a sense of solidarity? Which lives and which deaths are prioritized? What kind of matters and who matters to Catholics during each of these cases? Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit to start about the situation with the Black Death. You've heard from some of the past presenters in this course about the Black Death and the conditions surrounding it, so I'm not going to recap all of that information for you today. But as you know, the height of the Black Death is said to have occurred from 1347 to 1351 in Europe. And this was the most fatal pandemic that was recorded in human history, right? So by some estimations, about half of Europe's population is wiped out as a result of this plague. But for our purposes today, it's important to know that the Catholic Church is a very powerful presence in Europe during this time period as well. The Roman Catholic Church was a predominant religion in Europe, so it makes sense that when this plague kind of breaks out, Catholics often would turn to their church leaders to ask them for advice and for answers about, what's going on? How do we fix this? They're seeing tremendous, mortality, entire towns, entire families being wiped out. They want answers. And without the sort of scientific answers that we have today, the church was one of the sources of knowledge that people turned to. Okay. So what message did people initially get from the Pope, who's the head of the Catholic Church, or the bishops, or the priests who were below them? The primary message that they would have received from their Catholic leaders during this time was that sin was to blame, right? That God was angry at humanity because of the overwhelming sins that existed in the world. And the plague was sent as kind of a punishment to try and get humanity back on track. So it might sound kind of harsh to our modern sensibilities, but this is the kind of operating mindset or worldview that people were operating out of, right? It wasn't entirely hopeless though, right? Because what Catholic leaders told their communities was that if they wanted to kind of push the Black Death away, if they wanted to get the plague kind of out of their towns and out of their families, that they could do so by cleansing their souls, right? So they said, you can participate in the sacraments, our rituals. You can kind of protect yourselves from the plague by showing your devotion to God and showing how committed you are to your Catholic faith, right? So their recommendations, the sort of specific things that they told Catholics to do, go to Mass more, right? Go to our weekly services regularly, go extra times during the week if you can, right? Confess your sins to your local priest, make sure your soul has been cleansed, that you've taken that weight off of your soul. You can do fasting, you can pray more, you can participate in religious processions, right? These big marches that would go through different towns and villages. So these were seen as a way of kind of bonding together to overcome kind of collective sin. So the idea here, the kind of main takeaway so far during this time period, is that if God is angry at all of humanity, then we need to work together as a community in order to overcome sin. Okay. So I want to share some specifics to help you better understand what this looked like and what this felt like for people at the time. Okay. So the quote that you see on the screen here, this was taken from a special mass that was composed by the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church during this time period. Pope Clement VI was the head of the Catholic Church, and he wrote a special mass, a special service for Catholics. And the idea was that for those who participated, they were supposed to, just in hearing these words and participating in the service, attain a special degree of protection against the Black Death. So it's as if the words themselves are a kind of amulet or something that kind of shields them from some of this plague. So let's see, this is just part of what he wrote, but let's look at these passages together. He says, "O God, who desirest not the death of a sinner, but rather that he should repent, we beseech thee graciously to convert thy people unto thyself, that whilst they remain devoted unto thee, thou mayest mercifully put away from them thy rod of thy wrath," right? So this idea that God wants people to redeem themselves, he wants to see repentance, wants to be able to forgive people, even though there is this kind of anger that's being, spewed forth through the plague. A later part of that same, that same mass quotes part of the book of Luke, so from the Gospels in the Catholic Bible, the Christian Bible. So this part of Luke says, "A multitude of the diseased and they that were vexed with unclean spirits came unto Jesus, for there went out virtue of him and healed them all," right? So this idea that in the Bible, those who cleansed their spirits, those who appealed to Jesus, to Christ, or to God, had the opportunity to experience not only spiritual healing, but also kind of physical healing as well. So these are the sorts of examples and ways of thinking that the Pope is encouraging people to kind of draw from during this time of what feels very chaotic and terrifying to people, right? Not understanding why people are suddenly dying. Okay. So as a result of this way of thinking, what you start to see are a real focus on the sacraments, and especially two sacraments in particular. So one is the sacrament of Holy Communion, which is receiving the Eucharist. So receiving, from the Catholic perspective, the body of Christ by going to Mass and receiving this token of bread. And also the anointing of the sick. So the anointing of the sick gives people who are not in good health the opportunity to confess their sins, to receive communion, and to receive a special blessing, so that if they don't, survive, they go into the afterlife kind of in a good state with God, right? So what you see in the image on the slide here is an image that would have been pretty popular during this time period, right, or a scene of church authorities going out in all sorts of different circumstances, trying to make sure that every person has the opportunity to confess their sins, to grow closer to God, which will also collectively, hopefully, lift the plague or the Black Death. Right? So church authorities believed that their main responsibility was to make sure that every person had the chance to confess their sins and be buried in kind of consecrated or blessed ground if they did pass away. So actually one of the outcomes that you see as a result of this behavior, as you can imagine, now that we know how diseases kind of work, is that many of the priests and the monks and the nuns who were serving people in the community died in disproportionate numbers because they were exposed so much more to the Black Death. So actually a few decades after some of the waves of the Black Death had gone through Europe, what you start to see is a huge priest shortage because there's just, so many people who have died trying to serve those, giving them the chance to redeem themselves from sin, right? Okay, and then one other thing I wanted to share with you about the Black Death in terms of a practice or a ritual that became very common is centered more around the processions, right? So processions, basically the Pope and the local bishops told Catholics that one of the important things they should do is they should gather everyone together and to pray together for God's forgiveness. So as a result, these religious processions, these marches through different cities and towns became very popular. So participants would usually start kind of in a given place together. They would wind through the different streets of the town or the city together. And then they would usually end at an important shrine or church or site that had a religious significance for their community. And what you see pictured on the slide here is actually one kind of subgroup of the Catholic Church that emerges during the 1300s, which is a group known as the Flagellant movement. So this is a group that started off in Austria, and then it later spread to different parts of Europe as well. And these you might think of as the kind of extreme marchers. These are folks who would not only process and go on these very, very long marches through different cities and even countries, kind of atoning for sin, but they were known for self-mortification, so whipping themselves as a sign of their real extreme penance, their real extreme desire to receive forgiveness from God, right? So whipping themselves in a way that would mortify or kind of damage their own bodies at times. What's interesting, though, is that Pope Clement did not approve of this behavior. He actually banned the practice and kind of cracked down on it at different points in time. He said, basically, this group is ineffective, they're disruptive, they're upsetting to other people, I don't support this. But one of the other things that this group was known for also is they were very critical of other groups in society that they saw as sinful because they believed that it was also important for everyone to overcome sin. So anyone who is outside the Catholic Church, anyone who they saw as threatening the Catholic tradition, they would decry as kind of sinful and spread this kind of hate speech about other groups as well. And this leads to the kind of last point about the imagined community during this time that I wanted for us to think about together. So as we think about the Catholic responses to the Black Death back in the 1300s, one thing that's important to know, and it really ties in with what Dr. Petersen was talking about in terms of who we think about when we think about the most vulnerable, right, during times of plague. As Catholics became increasingly frustrated by the fact that, they're going to Mass, they're praying, and yet they're still seeing so many people dying and kind of suffering, this turns into a sort of scapegoating of different communities in Europe as well. And one of the groups that was really scapegoated during the time of the Black Death were Jewish citizens, right? So Jews and Catholics had had a very complicated and sometimes antagonistic relationship for hundreds of years leading up to this point. And so when it came time to search for other sorts of explanations for why Catholics were suffering, some felt that Jews themselves must be to blame. And this led to forms of extreme violence against Jewish communities. A lot of them had their property seized by church officials. They were kind of kicked out of different places. And some of them were actually kind of burned or otherwise killed by Catholics in their community. So we see, this intense desire for meaning that sometimes takes a very violent turn as well. Okay. So the kind of main takeaways for me so far as we start to think about this case of the Black Death, and then we'll move into COVID in just a second here, right? We see the use of the sacraments as this tremendous commitment to collective responsibility, right? We all have to pull together. We're going to use our rituals to kind of do this, but we also see a very clearly demarcated line of inclusion and exclusion in terms of who is considered to be part of the community and who is capable kind of redemption. Okay. All right, so let's think about, let's hold this case in our mind as we turn to think about the situation with COVID-19 today. So I'm sure, many of the statistics and realities are familiar to many of you in terms of where things stand with this disease or this pandemic today. But almost 700,000 people had lost their lives as of yesterday. I didn't check the numbers this morning. And in today's world, we still see the Catholic Church as a very powerful kind of presence in the world, right? So as of 2019, which is our last reliable count, there were about 1.3 billion Catholics who lived across the globe and about 70 million Catholics in the United States. So almost a quarter of US society identifies as Catholic, which is part of the reason why I think it's so important as we think about religious responses and responses in the United States to think about the role that the church plays, right? And what we see, and we'll see in the cases that I'm going to share with you over the next couple of minutes, is that we still see a very strong commitment to this idea of collective responsibility within Catholic, circles and communities today. But the framing of that responsibility and what it looks like and the practices that have been put into place look radically different for a number of reasons. Okay, so let me share just a few things with you here. To understand the kind of current or contemporary Catholic understanding of the COVID situation, I think what's most helpful to look at is Pope Francis's special blessing called Urbi et Orbi that he gave back in March to an empty St. Peter's Square, right? And if you just look at this image, we talk about, apocalyptic moments or kind of dystopia, as Dr. Petersen was talking about. To see an empty St. Peter's Square, if any of you have ever visited Rome or walked through the Vatican, this in and of itself might be seen as kind of a symbol of, for many people, of what the kind of end of times looks like, to imagine a pope alone in the Vatican speaking to this empty audience, right? But the special blessing that Pope Francis gave, it's very rare for this particular blessing to be given outside of the context of particular moments. So normally, this is a blessing that's only delivered on Christmas and Easter and other key kind of special times, but Pope Francis chose to deliver it to the whole global community, via video cast and things, as a result of the COVID situation. So during this blessing, Pope Francis shares a passage from the Gospel of Mark that he chose for this special occasion. And in this story, we see Jesus and his disciples who are on this boat. So the disciples are the followers of Jesus. And they're out in the middle of a storm, and the disciples are terrified. Jesus is actually sleeping on the boat, which I love. But Jesus is sleeping, and they start appealing to him, and they say, save us, right? And initially it seems like Jesus isn't going to do anything. So the disciples become increasingly frustrated, right? And at one point they kind of lash out at Jesus and they say, do you not care if we perish? And so, after kind of eventually calming the storm, Jesus asks his followers, he says, why are you afraid? Have you no faith, right? So this is the kind of theme that Pope Francis chooses to kind of pick up on for the rest of the blessing and the kind of sermon or speech that he gives to his community, is this idea of faith, and not necessarily just blaming God for certain circumstances, right? But understanding that God is on your side, even in times of pandemic or plague, right? So this is what Pope Francis goes on to say in later parts of his talk that day. He says, in this world that you, God, love more than we do, we have gone ahead at breakneck speed, feeling powerful and able to do anything. Greedy for profit, we let ourselves get caught up in things and lured away by haste. We did not stop at your reproach to us. We were not shaken awake by wars or injustice across the world, nor did we listen to the cry of the poor or of our ailing planet. We carried on regardless, thinking we would stay healthy in a world that was sick. It is not the time of your judgment, but of our judgment. A time to choose what matters and what passes away, a time to separate what is necessary from what is not. Prayer and quiet service, these are our victorious weapons. So Pope Francis here is really trying to reframe our understanding of the pandemic in this moment, right? He's saying God is not absent or angry. God is suffering alongside us. God loves the world just as much as we love the world, if not more, right? He's kind of saying here, the virus is not the result of our sins against God necessarily, or just not that alone. It's really the result of our sins against the earth itself. It's the result of our sins against our fellow human beings who are also suffering in the world that we've created, by moving ahead at breakneck speed, by feeling so powerful that we can do anything we like with the world, right? So really thinking about the virus here instead as a result of the kind of ecological crisis that we've created for ourselves in the world today. So in this framing, it's not just up to God to overturn the pandemic, right? It's up to all of us. It's up to us to change the way that we operate socially and consider the impact that our collective greed and our ways of overdevelopment, to consider the impact that those are having on the world around us. Okay, so drawing from this more kind of contemporary or more ecologically focused way of thinking about pandemics, Pope Francis's recommendations to Catholics are very different from what we saw with Pope Clement, right? Pope Francis encourages Catholics to turn to prayer, to really contemplate how they treat the world around them, and also to focus on sort of quiet service and kind of inner reflection, as opposed to the sorts of extreme rituals that we saw during the time of the Black Death, right? So part of what this means is that instead of focusing on a lot of face-to-face kind of Catholic rituals and sacraments, we actually see a lot of sacraments and churches and dioceses shutting down all across the globe, right? Knowing that this is how the virus can actually be transmitted, the church chooses to prioritize kind of public health as opposed to participating together in shared face-to-face rituals. So the next few images that I'll show are just a time lapse of over the course of 2 days, how quickly US Catholic dioceses end up suspending the public masses that were taking place across the US. So this is on March 16th of this year. This is 1 day later on the 17th. And then this is 1 day after that, right? So over the course of just 24 hours, we see all of these Catholic services being canceled as knowledge about COVID is becoming increasingly widespread, and the church is desiring to create a better situation for public health. So if you were to look at places, even like here in San Diego, this is a banner that was put up in North Park, which is one of the neighborhoods here around San Diego, at one of the churches here. We start to see Catholic churches pivoting to live streaming masses, to doing things much more virtually in a way that they obviously couldn't do during the time of the Black Death. But doing things like drive-through confession, where you drive through in your car and you're still 6 feet away, but you're able to receive forgiveness for sins, virtual masses taking place online. So we see a radically different form of the sacraments, although many Catholics are still using the sacraments to give them a sense of kind of stability and security during very uncertain times. I would say, though, that this wasn't an easy transition for a lot of Catholics who I know, and people in my community as well. A lot of people have told me about how going to Mass means so much to them as Catholics, right? It's their opportunity to receive the Eucharist, which from the Catholic perspective is literally the body of Christ, right? It's literal divinity that you take into your body from the Catholic perspective. But also the sense of community, right, that usually going to Mass entails for people who are devoted to their faith and go on a regular basis. So there's this sense of kind of isolation that also comes from not being able to see your community face to face. That's hard for a lot of people. Okay, so just a few other things I wanted to share with you, and then I'll try and wrap it up from there. The article that you read for today also talks about how the Vatican has given special permission for things like the anointing of the sick to take place via video, which is not traditionally how it's done. And as you saw from the article that you read for today, this feels and looks very different for a lot of the folks who are participating in this ritual compared to what it has looked like in the past. So you can imagine that, in the past, when people were surrounded by their priest and surrounded by their family, and they received this physical blessing on their body, there's something really reassuring about quite literally being surrounded by those who are caring for you and praying for you, right? So I hope one of the things that we can tease out is, what do these kind of virtual, anointing of the sick processes look like or mean to those who are suffering and might actually be losing their lives in the near future, right? But here, I think the main kind of takeaway is collective responsibility. It looks more like sacrificing the intimacy of the sacraments, right? Sacrificing some of the things that the sacraments have actually meant in order to prioritize stopping the spread of the disease. Okay. All right, and my last point that I want to kind of think about together is just to think about this idea of imagined community from a Catholic perspective today. So Pope Francis and other Catholics, Catholic leaders across the globe have continued to push members of the Catholic laity or everyday kind of men and women in the Catholic Church to widen the limits of their empathy during the time of COVID. So asking Catholics to really consider how the most vulnerable people in society are being treated in the present moment. So I put a couple of quotes up here that are from an interview back in April, where Pope Francis says, we're realizing that all of our thinking, like it or not, has been shaped around the economy. In the world of finance, it has seemed normal to sacrifice people, to practice a politics of the throwaway culture. Right now, the homeless continue to be homeless. A photo appeared the other day of a parking lot in Las Vegas where they had been put in quarantine, and the hotels were empty. But the homeless cannot go to a hotel. That is the throwaway culture in practice. And he goes on to say, every crisis contains both danger and opportunity, the opportunity to move out from the danger. Today, I believe we have to slow down our rate of production and consumption and to learn to understand and contemplate the natural world. Okay, so what is Pope Francis saying here? He's really asking for a kind of radical recalibration of Catholic priorities, right? To stop imagining that some human lives are disposable, like those who are unsheltered in our community today, and thinking about how modern life needs to revolve more around people as opposed to money if we want to overcome things like COVID and prevent future situations like the spread of this disease. So again, the kind of broader question, we have a broader sense of collective identity or imagined community that's kind of being put forth by the Catholic leaders. But the question is, are everyday Catholics going to buy into this, right? I'd like to think that there might be some learning that takes place compared to the scapegoating and the kind of sense of disposable lives that we've seen in the future. But that remains to be seen, right? It remains to be seen whether or not Catholics will really adopt this way of thinking. Okay, so final points or final kind of questions for us to maybe think about or talk more about. As we think about the sacraments in times of crisis, many Catholics across time have turned to the sacraments as a way of deepening their connection to their faith and to foster what we might call a sense of agency, right? The sense of wanting to take action to a certain meaning in one's life, especially during a time of crisis, both personally and also collectively, right? And as we think about imagined community and inclusion and exclusion here, both cases raise questions about collective responsibility that are relevant for Catholics and non-Catholics alike. So what are our obligations to other people in the midst of a pandemic? How should we treat strangers and the socially marginalized? And this could be kind of more broadly thinking about kind of racial dynamics in our country and other things, but it can also be the way that we treat everyday people when we go to the grocery store or other situations, right? And then one other question to kind of think about, given that you're about to start your first year at the University of San Diego, what does it mean to attend the University of San Diego, right? This is a school that identifies as an engaged contemporary Catholic university. What does it mean to come and be part of this community in the time of a pandemic? What does it mean for all of us, right? How do these Catholic values and ways of thinking, how do they or how might they inform the work that we're all going to do in the coming year together? And then like Dr. Petersen, I have some other resources and stuff that I'm happy to share with you, but I think I'm a little bit over time. So I think I'm going to end it there.
In my presentation, we're moving from the sublime to the mundane. And part of what you heard was the power of narrative, of fiction to help us make sense of the world around us. You also heard about the power of faith, but also the power of the priesthood to deliver ways in which one can express one's faith. What we're going to do now is to look at how the power not only to make rules, but those who make the rules, how do they make those rules? Whom do those rules benefit? And what does this mean for us living in a national society? How do we see ourselves? So let's start out by talking about the political life and the way in which we lead that political life. We live in a world divided into sovereign nation states. All of the land's surface is divided into these nation states. Each nation state serves as a political container for the lives its citizens lead within its borders. And we socialized from a very young age to think of the country we inhabit as a home to which we owe a special allegiance and in which we share a sense of national belonging, right? That we feel closer to Americans. In a sense, for instance, the way the Catholic community is a global community. And one might ask oneself what one's responsibilities are as a member of a Catholic community that is global, and what our responsibilities are as American citizens. What are the ways in which those two responsibilities may go well together or conflict with one another? Now, in terms of this sense of national belonging, Dr. DeConinck mentioned Benedict Anderson and the notion of imagined community. And one of the things I'd like to have you consider is that this sense of nationalism is based on a constructed identity. None of us is born thinking of ourselves as American or Brazilian or Canadian. This message is reinforced every day when children recite the Pledge of Allegiance in school or place their hand on their hearts when the national anthem is played. Patriotism or love of homeland is nurtured by the many performative acts of citizenship and other associative acts in which we participate, whether it is the franchise or joining civic groups to promote community well-being. We are therefore conditioned to be more concerned about the welfare of our fellow citizens over people from other countries. We expect our leaders to promote our nation's interests. In other words, to promote the security and welfare of the United States and its citizens. But ask yourselves, what happens when we confront a problem that spatially transcends the borders of a single country? And its leaders cannot on their own solve that problem effectively without seeking cooperation from other countries. Can we begin to think about our membership in an international community to which we have a collective responsibility? Can we see ourselves also as global citizens with stewardship for our planet and of people everywhere? And then ask also, if in order to deal with transnational challenges, we need multilateral cooperation or cooperation among myriad countries in the world, how would we go about achieving such an objective? What sort of governing modalities would we need to accomplish such a goal? Now, I don't have to tell you this because you can see it in the world around you. Transnational problems have multiplied in a world of increasing interdependence. For instance, supply chains for production are globally sourced, interlinking national economies and consumers around the world. People travel far and wide for work and leisure, taking with them new ideas and cultures which are seeded in the individuals with whom they interact. We communicate instantaneously with people and groups around the world at the click of a mouse, and we connect with like-minded people virtually across the globe. On the flip side, political violence and repression lead to refugees who are forced to cross borders to seek safety. In such a situation, problems of political and social instability in one country have an impact on other countries. Organized crime, drugs, and terrorism represent a trifecta of interconnected global problems and threats. And then there are the challenges posed by the natural world, of which climate change and pandemics are examples. Clearly, states need to find ways to come together with common purpose to address global problems that require global solutions. State-centric approaches are not effective in tackling problems that span state boundaries. Transnational problems are not new, but they are acquiring increasing urgency due to the scale, scope, and speed of globalization. Global governance mechanisms fill the interstitial gaps, the policy gaps that a world divided into sovereign states create. In order to create effective global governance mechanisms, leading countries or powerful countries have to take the initiative. Powerful states have both the resources and influence needed to exercise leadership in establishing formal international organizations or informal international institutions with rules and procedures governing specific issue areas with strong incentives for state participation. After the end of World War II, for instance, when the United States inaugurated a period of Pax Americana, Washington took the lead in the founding of global institutions for exactly such purposes, creating formal organizations such as the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development to provide for economic development of war-torn countries and for global monetary stability. And later, informal institutions such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, as well as the creation of the many functional organizations under the United Nations auspices, such as the Food and Agricultural Organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and the World Health Organization. These organizations and institutions were established to address pressing issues that spanned state borders. The pandemic unleashed by the novel coronavirus, and I'll keep calling it the coronavirus, even though its official name of the virus is SARS-CoV-2. But I think, we're calling it the coronavirus, so I'll call it that. And you know that the disease caused by the coronavirus is COVID-19. So having specified that, I'll just say coronavirus and COVID-19 from now on. So the pandemic unleashed by this virus, which causes the COVID-19 disease, falls under the definition of a transnational problem that requires a cooperative global approach for its management, mitigation, and containment. Even if one country effectively contains the spread of the virus, as long as the infection rages in other countries, the country that has been successful in virus containment would have to seal its borders completely until the rest of the countries achieve successful containment. The example of the United States serves as a microcosm of this global problem. We are a federal state with 50 units under the federation. Because Washington did not implement a national or federal strategy to deal with the pandemic, leaving each state to adopt its own stringent or lax measures to mitigate the spread of the coronavirus, effective mitigation efforts in one state were unlikely to be successful in the long run if neighboring states had surging infection rates and travel between the two was unrestricted. You can see then why at the global level, unless we develop a coordinated strategy, we will see roving cycles of infection spread unless the virus weakens naturally through mutation or we develop an effective vaccine. Even in the latter case, if countries begin to engage in what some scholars have called vaccine nationalism, we will not only exacerbate interstate conflict, but we will also prolong the challenge posed by the pandemic to countries the world over. Two factors have complicated the task of developing a multilateral umbrella initiative under which countries could craft nationally effective strategies to deal specifically with the current pandemic. The first factor is the waning of Pax Americana. The second factor, which is both a cause and consequence of the first, is rising economic and political nationalism in many countries around the world. exemplified in the United States by President Trump's America First approach to foreign policy, and in China by President Xi Jinping's articulation of the Chinese dream. The United States and China, which are the two strongest powers in the international system, are currently locked in a strategic competition. This protracted struggle for power and influence between the United States and China has unduly politicized the World Health Organization. Headquartered in Geneva, the World Health Organization is the premier international agency that was founded in 1948 with strong support from the United States for the promotion of global public health. The World Health Organization followed almost a century after the first International Sanitary Conference was convened in Paris in 1851 in response to the 1830 and 1847 cholera epidemics. Other conferences followed, 14 in all between 1851 and 1938, with the aim of establishing a mechanism for international cooperation in disease control and prevention. These early efforts were only partially successful due to strong political differences that frustrated interstate cooperation. In 1892, that's around the turn of the 20th century, an international sanitary convention dealing with cholera was passed. And 5 years later, a convention for the plague was signed. The League of Nations, set up after World War I, created a health organization which could be considered a predecessor to the World Health Organization. The success of the World Health Organization can be chalked to the leadership role played by Washington in putting US geopolitical weight behind this organization. This success is under threat now due to the rising tides of insular nationalism in the United States and China since 2014. The current Director General of the WHO is Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the former Health and Foreign Minister of Ethiopia, who was elected for a 5-year term by WHO members in May 2017. Before we look into the failures of the WHO and the current pandemic, let us examine a few of its successes. When it was established, the first priorities of the WHO were to control the spread of diseases such as malaria and tuberculosis, as well as to improve maternal and child health, nutrition, and environmental hygiene. The WHO's first legislative act focused on the compilation of accurate statistics on the spread and morbidity of disease. In 1958, Viktor Zhdanov, Deputy Minister of Health for the USSR, Soviet Union, called on the World Health Assembly to undertake a global initiative to eradicate smallpox. 2 million people were dying from smallpox every year at this time. In 1967, the WHO intensified the global smallpox eradication by contributing 2.4 million annually to the effort and adopted a new disease surveillance method. The initial problem the WHO team faced was inadequate reporting of smallpox cases. Does that sound familiar to you in our current pandemic? WHO established a network of consultants who assisted countries in setting up surveillance and containment activities. After over 2 decades of fighting smallpox, the WHO declared in 1979 that the disease had been eradicated, the first disease in history to be eliminated by human effort. And here are 3 of the former directors of the smallpox eradication program reading the report of the eradication of smallpox. And that was a huge achievement. Since then, the WHO has undertaken the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, which it launched in 1988. And the incidence of this disease has largely been arrested in all but a handful of countries. After its experience with the 2003 outbreak of the H5N1 virus that caused severe acute respiratory syndrome, this was the first SARS epidemic, the the WHO established a pandemic framework called the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response System. And part of what I want to do now is try to explain to you how geopolitical tensions have undermined the ability of the WHO to be effective in the current pandemic. The WHO's record on the coronavirus has been much more debatable. The first case was registered in the city of Wuhan in China's Hubei province in November 2019. The WHO China office reported the initial cluster in December 2019, isolated the virus on January 7, 2020, and then shared the genetic sequence of COVID-19 on January 12, 2020, to ensure proper diagnostic kit developments. But the Chinese government initially suppressed information about the novel coronavirus and denied that human-to-human transmission was taking place. This misinformation was tweeted by the WHO as late as January 14, 2020, without the caveats that by that time even the Chinese government was offering, by indicating that such transmission could not be excluded, even while insisting that the risk was low. Appealing to the object and purpose of the international health regulations, the WHO continued to remind countries of the need for proportionality in applying measures that are restricted to public health risks and which avoid unnecessary interference with international traffic and trade. So the WHO was continuing not to take this very seriously. By January 20, officials in Wuhan publicly confirmed human-to-human transmission and instituted a lockdown in Wuhan. But the genie had been let out of the bottle, as millions of Wuhan residents had traveled all over China and around the world, as these early weeks coincided with festivities associated with the Chinese New Year. Given the fast spread of the infection, the WHO finally, on March 11, characterized COVID-19 and coronavirus as a pandemic. These delays led to catastrophic results, with a global fatality rate from COVID-19 standing at 685,000, over 685,000 by August 2, and Dr. DeConinck shared that figure with you, with the United States accounting for the largest share of this number at 155,000. US-China tensions have politicized the World Trade Organization, with the Trump administration blaming both China and the WHO Director General for foot dragging and for minimizing the dangers of the global spread of COVID-19. Structural problems at the WHO have exacerbated its vulnerability to misinformation and political influence. In line with the Trump administration's lack of interest in multilateral institutions, the US seat on the WHO's executive board has been left vacant since 2018. Consider that. We didn't have a voice there. At a time when China was assiduously cultivating influence in the very international organizations that President Trump was denigrating. Upset with what the administration sees as the Chinese manipulation of the WHO, President Trump notified Congress in July this year of his intent to withdraw US membership from the WHO. This is going to take effect in July 2021. Almost immediately, there was bipartisan pushback against this move, and the Democratic presidential nominee, Joe Biden, has promised to reverse this decision if he were to win. These geopolitical tensions between the United States and China have had the effect not only of impeding cooperative international measures to combat the spread of coronavirus and the COVID-19 disease that it causes, but also of exacerbating global governance gaps in knowledge, norms, policy, institutions, and compliance. These governance gaps are manifested in the inadequacy of the collective global effort to mount an effective response to combat the pandemic. So as noted earlier, in an increasingly globalized world, states have had to develop cooperative but imperfect global governance mechanisms to address transnational challenges. The coronavirus pandemic illustrates 5 major global governance gaps in knowledge, norms, policies, institutions, and compliance that international relations scholars identify. The knowledge gap refers to the lack of consensus about the nature, causes, gravity, and magnitude of a global problem. And a serious challenge that the resolution of this gap poses is that ideology can determine what information is made available and is acceptable. Or it can even trump hard data. The early misinformation from China and the continued misinformation and misplaced optimism from President Trump and other world leaders with respect to the severity of and possible cures for the coronavirus have undermined efforts to check its spread. The normative gap arises when states not only fail to observe commonplace and expected rules governing behavior, but also resist being singled out for egregiously flaunting international norms. Concern over national prestige has led states to place national interests over collective global responsibility in fighting the pandemic. Think about references to the China virus or Kung flu. Think also about China's mask diplomacy, in which they're trying to cover up, literally and figuratively, their missteps early on in the pandemic. The policy gap results from the contradiction between the need for effective global solutions to transboundary problems and the policy authority for tackling them that remains vested and nested in states. As states have sought to minimize the economic impact of the pandemic on their economies, leaders have kneecapped cooperation between their national health policy agencies and the WHO. Multilateral institutions of global governance lack authority and adequate resources, creating an institutional gap. While the WHO can be blamed for an inadequate response, multilateral institutions are only as strong as states will allow them to be. State funding of the WHO means that its leaders have to walk a fine line between the need for disseminating accurate information and encouraging information sharing from other states, on the one hand, while holding states accountable on the other. This is especially true of powerful states, which are the largest donors to the WHO. The compliance gap is a consequence of inadequate enforcement mechanisms that allow states to routinely flaunt international standards, almost always with impunity. The WHO does not wield any enforcement powers except the Court of World Public Opinion to compel states to observe international standards. During the SARS outbreak in 2003, a WHO spokesman criticized China for its lack of transparency and preparation, which had allowed the virus to spread unchecked. China later even admitted to mistakes in handling the outbreak. But that was when the United States continued to exercise a global leadership role and played an important function in the WHO. But at the end of the second decade of the 21st century, the primary international system change driving global geopolitical dynamics is the process of power transition between the United States and China, which is a fast-rising peer competitor to the United States. Under President Trump, the United States has unilaterally chosen to abdicate global leadership. This abdication is exemplified by US withdrawal from a slew of multilateral agreements. The Trump administration has also cast China as a revisionist power and injected a high level of uncertainty and hostility in the US-China relationship. Under these conditions, the fact that no critique of China has been forthcoming from the WHO is not surprising. I'll end here, but I think you've had a clear sense of the failure of leadership at multiple levels that has come in the way of crafting an effective global solution to this pandemic?
We've heard some fascinating things today already, and I come in from an engineering school, might seem like a bit of an outlier, and it certainly does to a lot of people, but think about what you have heard already today. I'd be kind of fascinated to know how many of you students are thinking about a technical or a scientific career. I'm hoping that many of you are, and that you're listening to this. It's very important, however, that we go forward in a very transdisciplinary way. And I think that what is so special about this course is that you're all hearing so many different frameworks all at once and mixing them up in your head and coming up with a really interesting blend with which to start your studies. And so when you go into your studies and whatever classes you take, you'll be hearing them from the multiple perspectives that you've heard from this course. And that will give you a unique perspective. We always say we rely on our youth to kind of solve our problems. And we talked about that with climate change. And now it seems even more so that you guys are picking up the pieces of what we've done. So what I'm going to be doing in this presentation is thinking about engineering, the lens of engineering, or the lens of making things. If you think about anything in society, whether it's the food we eat, the makeup we put on, the cars we drive, the fuels that drive them, the batteries that power our phones, the bicycles that we ride on, everything has an engineer somewhere in the background. And so, what you've heard about today, you've heard about the Pope talking about greed and profit driving over development, and perhaps we need to think about that. We've heard about progress, perhaps not considering or failing to see the need to interconnect ideas and ways of thinking. We've talked about the ideas of slowing down production and consumption. And Dr. Petersen, right in the beginning, talked about utopias, and one might question, and this idea of is a utopia worth the cost? My main question is thinking about, for who is it a utopia and who is it a dystopia right now in society? This is not a global everybody or everybody has a dystopia. Right now we have both, as far as I'm concerned. So let's look at this in more detail. So most of us don't think about it, but everything human-made has been engineered by someone for some reason. And my question is, who decides what is engineered and why, and who benefits and who pays? Those of you who study science and technology studies, sociology of science, philosophy of science, and those kinds of subjects, you will hear about these things, that society influences what we do as scientists or engineers, and in turn, engineering and science influence what we do in society. We call this social construction of technology, we call it technological determinism, but essentially, let's look at the picture on the left. Society influences what we do as scientists or engineers. So we've got here a design team task. Let's create a machine to produce 6 million burgers in a minute. Whatever it is that we're asking students to produce, we engineers tend to think that it's great to do it more efficiently, to somehow create more and more and more and more. And for many years, including when I was training as a materials engineer, we didn't think at all about the environmental implications of that, let alone the social implications of that. And we definitely didn't think about the health implications of that. We're just trying to do it as quickly as we can. But why are we doing that? So here we have society influencing us, and right now, right in the realms of neoliberalism, where profit is king, We are given the idea through multinational corporations, through people who own shares, through the governments, that somehow we need to make money. We need to make it very, very quickly, and we need to make a lot of it. And the only way of making it is by producing more and selling more. This whole game of production and consumption. And of course, scientists and engineers get caught up in all of that. They do that because that's where the money comes from. And that's because their bosses tell them to do that. And they don't want to be the whistleblower in their establishment. So they move. I've had graduates of my engineering classes come to me 6 months after graduating and saying, you know, Caroline, all of those things that you talked about, they're coming true. You know, I'm responsible as a design engineer for creating a program which works out how many people can lose their jobs this month, so we save money. And I have those people coming to the office door saying, you just lost my job. I can't pay my bills. I'm going to lose my home. And I never realized I would be in that situation to cause that much harm. I was just doing some computer programming. Because we never prepared that student for what to do and how to think about it when their boss asked them to do that. So what happens then? So science and engineering learn how to do these things, and they get used to doing these things. And then to the picture on the right, we then affect how we live in society. And that kind of creates a norm. You know, we get more and more used to it. So we sit behind computer screens. Right now, we don't have much choice. But even before the pandemic, we were sitting in front of our computer screens for an awful long time in the day. Now, many of us have kind of fought back against that and said, no, I don't want that kind of lifestyle. But it's a conscious choice not to. And you're often considered somebody who's ruining their career if you don't do what's normal. And so we have sort of behaved this way because now we've got these products and these systems and this infrastructure that calls us to do that and give us kind of benefits when we do it. And we get on our iPhones. And if we don't have an iPhone, we can't keep up with the latest deal or friends or whatever. We're out, we miss out because that's been created. And it's a cycle. Now, when we create something through science and engineering, or for any other development, we have intended and unintended outcomes. And these could be positive or negative. So let's look at the creation of a hydroelectric dam. And I was lucky enough to see a hydroelectric dam in Lesotho in Southern Africa, where I was working with a project of mine. And that dam certainly produced energy. Lots and lots of energy. In the unintended consequence, the positive unintended consequence might be that it proves a tourist attraction and generates capital. In the case of Lesotho, that wasn't true, but in some places it certainly is. The intended negative, in the sense that you don't really want to do harm, but you know it's a necessary thing that you have to do. So you take it into consideration in your cost-benefit analysis, and you realize you just got to displace those people. And so a lot of people are pushed out of their homes for this dam. And that's something you just, well, sorry, got to suck it up. Sorry, that's just going to have to happen. But there's many unintended negative consequences which the designers don't think about. Or they may sadly be intended in the sense that they also think of those as necessary evils, and that is the alteration of the ecosystem. In this case, there's a case of a particular natural predator of snails that is damaged by the ecosystem alteration, and that increases the incidence of this schistosomiasis, which is a particular disease. And could have been preventable. And so here you see the kind of the fact between the creation of something that was intended to create electricity, and we end up with people getting very sick as an unintended consequences. And unfortunately, all too often, this happens. And right now, we're questioning what could possibly be the ecosystem damage that's caused the pandemic. And you were asked to do a reading along those lines. And what the article told you was that there were pressures of increasing economic growth, as we've just mentioned. There's the idea of dense urbanization, people moving more and more and more into the cities and needing more roads and more houses and more hospitals in those places. More land has to be turned into a place for buildings and so on. Also globalization, as we heard in the previous speech, about how we're kind of increasingly interconnected, and we need more and more development infrastructure to support that. Political ecology, the fact that we have political, economic, and social factors relating to environmental issues and change. We heard very clearly about the World Health Organization being influenced by the political structures. But when we think about the whole political ecology, we have to look at all of the factors that cause these things to affect the environmental context. And ecosystem destruction is therefore not an isolated thing that happens. And the author talks also about planetary health, the link between human and ecological health. So if we destroy our delicate ecosystem balance by overdevelopment, by increasing development of the land and the infrastructure, then we're starting to actually encroach upon these systems which have been in balance for a long time, and which, when they're out of balance, creates all sorts of harmful effects on human health. So the author questions, is it possible that it was human activity, such as building, mining, hunting, and logging, that triggered the Ebola epidemics and it's unleashing new terrors? We cut the trees, we kill the animals or cage them, and we send them to markets. We disrupt ecosystems, and we shake viruses loose from their natural hosts. And when that happens, they need a new host. Often we are it. He goes on to say that the disruption of the pristine forests driven by logging, mining, road building through remote places, rapid urbanization, population growth is bringing people into closer contact with animal species they may never have been near before. And this demand for wood, minerals, and resources from the global north leads to the degraded landscapes and ecological disruption that drives the disease. So it's not just a wet market. It's not just eating of a certain kind of an animal. That may be caused by moving into a forest and animals being closer to the urbanization. But the actual fact that we need to push out and push out and push out into these forests and into other lands is because somewhere else in the world, we're wanting more and more and more minerals. We're wanting more and more and more resources because we want to make more and more products so that we can make more and more money and create our lovely utopia. But it isn't so utopian for those people who are suffering the consequences of those, and now we're all suffering the consequences of those. So what I want to do is just ask this question. So what is an engineering development and public health kind of altogether response to COVID-19? And I would say, you know, the immediate thing that my colleagues in engineering might think is that we want to create masks and ventilators, and I would absolutely agree. These are necessary, critical to prevent people from getting sick, to help them get cured. Unfortunately, they're not preventing the disease. That's done, right? It's preventing the spread and helping the cure. So they're mitigating against this thing that has already happened. But what you, in the beginning of your career, have the opportunity of doing is to think in a transdisciplinary way about how we can prevent future pandemics or other disasters of this kind of extent. We want to think about the causal factors, and we want to co-create in a transdisciplinary way prevention and mitigation strategies. So prevention strategies, what does that look like for future pandemics? As well as to think about designing equitable and sustaining possibilities for planetary health. And what I wanted to do was just give you 3 examples in my own work to kind of give you a lens through which to understand what I'm talking about. I think sometimes those of us who are not engineers might say, well, I really haven't got a clue about that. That's, maths and other stuff. And I often hear politicians and wonderful people talking about, the Green New Deal and other wonderful things that could happen in society. And yet the way that they talk about the technology needed is kind of shallow. What's interesting is that they're able to come up with an overall idea of what's wanted, but not the specifics of how it might happen. Inevitably so, because they haven't studied those technical subjects. So we need scientists and engineers here at the table to join with people from philosophy and theology and literature and social science and public health to ask the questions, to deconstruct society, to deconstruct the past, to understand from 700 years ago what happened and what went wrong or what went right, and to try and understand how to create new systems today that learn from our past. And maybe, as in this slide here, we need to change the materials that we use. Now, I was lucky enough to be part of a BBC production series called Building the Impossible some years back. And we had to try and build crazy things like Roman catapults and airships out of materials using the knowledge that would have been available at that time in the 16th century or the 17th century. And what I learned was that natural materials are pretty damn good. Nature's got some damn good ideas on how to solve its structural, functional problems. We've created many, many, many really wonderful materials, but we haven't thought about the implications of that. As a materials engineer, I can tell you, I'm not completely ancient, but when I was going through my degree, I did not learn about the ecological impact of what we were doing. We still don't teach the social impact in many places. So let's look at this. This picture here involves the case of Maxima Chaupe, who is an environmental activist in Peru. And we went to interview her in Cajamarca, where she was having trouble because Newmont Mines are trying to build a mine on her traditional land. This is a very typical situation. And we actually made a film about her that was shown to the United Nations and helped support her case. That filming had to be done under cover of darkness because she was very much at risk of getting harmed. Her family had been beaten up many times to the point that her 2 adult children could not concentrate in university. They were most of your ages, but they couldn't think straight because they'd been beaten around the head with batons so many times by the police, as you see in some of these pictures, who were basically terrorizing them to try and get them to stop protesting so that the mine could go ahead. These are just some of the tactics used by mining companies. The worst part is that the environmental damage done is not just damaging to these people's lifestyles because the water is poisoned, which is bad enough, but it is also damaging the whole ecosystem. And that is not studied, and that is not paid for. And so the utopia that is our life with our iPhones and our other products is paid for by the lives of people like Maxima Chaupe, but also the whole ecosystem. So what happens when a mine comes into that area? Basically, it changes the ecosystem. It changes the placement of parasites. The parasites were killed by another virus-eating creature, and basically end up with an overall, a pandemic proportion of this parasite. The animals get sick, the people eat the animals, the people get sick. But when the mine comes in and says, no, sorry, it wasn't anything to do with us, your cows just picked up a disease, nothing is done to connect the dots. So we need to really think about what materials we use, whether we can dig them out of the ground, whether we can dig them in a different way out of the ground, and make a study on what it's doing to the ecosystem. The second example I want to give you is what we do when we create and reuse materials through waste. Now, obviously, something like a tree doesn't use any waste. It uses waste. It doesn't create any waste. The whole thing is in perfect cycle with its surrounding nature. Well, we create a lot of waste. We create endless waste. And what happens when we create waste? It creates disease. I work in Sri Lanka using waste as a resource. And dengue fever is absolutely rife in Sri Lanka, caused a lot by the garbage, which is just basically thrown into a landfill, and which spreads all over the place because there's no proper processing of the waste. When I first started working there about 6 or 7 years ago, using waste to actually create new products was a very novel idea. And so we've moved from waste as a crisis to waste as a resource within just 7 years. That roof of that toilet block behind my team there is made of banana fiber and plastic bags, the banana fiber being a waste product also. And so using waste can actually change the health of the environment by removing such diseases as dengue fever. And it's an immediate cycle. You don't even have to think about it to understand that one. And the last one, which is not my area, but I wanted to mention it because it's so important, is the way that we grow and distribute food. So pesticides and genetic modification and massive farming, these are all supported by different forms of engineering, bioengineering, chemical engineering, and here we see mechanical engineering and all of the different machines that are created to enable this kind of over-farming that happens, massive amounts of deforestation and land use, the change to the ecosystem that's caused by removing different kinds of crops. And you end up with 5 or 6 types of potato instead of 10,000 types of potatoes. So the disease comes by, it can decimate the population of potatoes very quickly. There's nothing to fall back on. The whole system of food production is very changed. And of course, that leads us directly to understand the connection with the pandemic currently. So just in those 3 areas of the materials that we choose to use, the way in which we use waste, and the way in which we grow and also distribute food with all of its packaging. These 3 areas, we as engineers and scientists could start to work on different systems, different ways of being, together with those of you who also understand perhaps the context of the problems. So in that short space of time, I've tried to give you a way in which engineering and development is strongly connected to our health.
Dr. Barger is here. She was here with us a couple of weeks ago, and she's going to help moderate.
One question that everyone brought, that several people brought up, and I think it can be addressed to many people on the panel, is with the continued references to the Black Plague, how much can we really compare these two, the Black Plague and COVID events, since although human emotions don't change a lot, as time goes by, we're talking about 2 very different societies that are pretty different. So, what is the comparison? Is the comparison a good one? Can we learn things, or are the 2 circumstances just so different?
So I have a lot of thoughts about that. And one, I will tell you a funny kind of anecdote. As I've been kind of doing my historical research, because I don't read about pandemics all the day, every day in my normal life. I kept having this common thought as I was going back and reading colonial texts, and I was like, I'm so glad that it's COVID-19 and not hemorrhagic flu or smallpox, because there are all these descriptions of disease of like bleeding out eyes, and that really feels like in a zombie apocalypse. So each disease and its manifestation is different. In the same way that Dr. Miller told us that we have to go back and understand how all of these historical moments have played out, it's the same understanding the past and past responses to be able to understand what's happening now. So microbes are different, our scientific knowledge is different, but and the way that we form communities are different. We have communities on Zoom, for example, but there are threads in common in so many of these things, right? Not the diseases, but when we are facing pandemics affecting us all, there are things that we can learn from the past, even the microbe or society is completely different.
I would chime in just thinking from the religious perspective. Yeah, I think when we think about the Black Death, it does seem like a totally different world in so many ways, right? And our knowledge of how disease operates has evolved tremendously since that point in time. And yet, we still don't have all of the answers to our current situation with the coronavirus, right? And so I think what I'm interested in is, even though the cases might be very different in some ways, some of the core human dilemmas that emerge and the questions of how do we operate in a world that is uncertain and where we don't know the exact ways that, the virus is transmitted, or, people who might be transmitters but not necessarily realizing it, or things like that. How do we operate ethically under situations of uncertainty, right? That is a question that I think, even if the circumstances are different, is still relevant. And I think also as situations evolve, right, we're in a different historical moment now, our questions become more complicated in some ways too, right? And I was thinking, as Dr. Baillie was speaking, about how our notion of collective responsibility, it doesn't even just include humans anymore, right? This imagined community now has to include the natural earth and animals, and it's a whole different way of thinking about community than what we've seen in the past, but in some ways grows off of those past conversations. So I think that's how I would respond for my discipline.
The political problem of power is something that's been with us always. How do those people who have power respond, and how do they act? And if you're looking at the period of the Black Plague, nation states are a very modern phenomenon. They don't start in Europe until the 17th century, and it's only by through the vehicle of colonialism that this modality, this political form, is foisted on countries around the world. I mean, if any of you are wondering why there's so much political violence in non-European societies, consider that centuries of political evolution was essentially disrupted. Culture areas were destroyed through colonialism. And that's, adding to some of what Dr. Baillie was talking about, which is what, our capitalist mindset often gets us to do, which is exploit resources of the planet. And so the problem of power, I would say, is the same. I think the scale and scope of what we're dealing with is different.
It's always worth looking back to understand the context. It's surprising what we can learn, just speaking as an engineer from Mayan cultures and, looking at the public health system of the Romans. They thought about sanitation for the first time. And so we had water, hot water, and other systems like that. So just because we're looking back hundreds of years doesn't mean that we're somehow regressing. We've gone in cycles in our societies. And so I think looking at all these things intersecting and what worked and what didn't work at that time and bringing the best forward. It's like I work a lot with Indigenous peoples who have been doing things for 40,000 years, and we learn from them about how to sustain our planet in ways that we have absolutely no idea about now.
Can we use dystopian fiction and literature to help mitigate the effects of the pandemic and how people react to a crisis?
I wouldn't necessarily use the word mitigate. But I think that the more deep understanding that we can have, and also come from a tradition of literature that is very political, and that's common lots of post-colonial contexts, but Latin America and here have been deeply politically connected. So I believe literature can give us insight into the resilience of people and human responses, some of how we respond to uncertainty, some of narrative conspiracy theories. Fear is about trying to give meaning to something that we can't fully. Some of it's about what will be the impact of this in disciplines in the future. We'll probably spend the rest of our lives in a certain way figuring out what that question is. How has this impacted us in so many societies? And this, reiterate a little bit what Dr. Shirk said last week. A lot of this will be the formative moment of your generation. It's certainly my generation. I'm a little bit older than you.
Dr. DeConinck, is the communal mindset of gathering in hopes to eventually end the plague still around during the current pandemic? And does this result in a tension between U.S. individualism and Catholic collectivity? Does this mean the Catholics are more likely to do things for the greater good or not? This sort of echoes some of the themes we discussed in week 2 on collectivism versus individualism.
And what I love about thinking about this question of these tensions is that all of us have these tensions at times in our lives, right? So I've been talking throughout my presentation about the Catholic Church, right? Kind of thinking in broad strokes about Catholic perspectives on the situation with COVID and the situation with the Black Death. But in reality, just as was the case historically, people don't just identify necessarily as Catholic, right? So I might identify as Catholic, but I also identify as American. I might identify with a particular religious community or ethnic community or a political party, right? And we all have these different aspects of our social location or our identity kind of acting on us, right? In any given moment in time. So I think what I like about this question, there's not a clear-cut answer to it, but I think that for many, there probably is a tension at times between what they're hearing from political leaders or what they're hearing from their family members or other people in society, and then also what the church is telling them, right? And people have to navigate that in their individual lives. They have to make decisions about what sorts of values or ways of thinking they're going to prioritize. And when we talk about the Catholic Church, there's actually like thousands of sub-Catholic churches in a way, right? All of the millions of people who identify, or billions across the globe. People bring the tradition to life in their own ways that aren't always consistent, right? And I think that complexity is actually one of the things that is most important for us to remember, that we're all shaped in different ways by these different influences in our lives. So it's probably not a clear-cut answer to your question, but what I love about the question is that there's not a clear-cut answer because, it is so individual in a way.
Questions about the politicization of WHO, both from the external bodies and the internal bodies. How do we learn what is, who gives them power, when they have the power, what do we need to do, given the mistakes that the WHO has made? How do we call them out on it, and how do we improve the WHO responses? I think essentially what they're saying is, how do we depoliticize the WHO given the fact that the WHO is dependent on these large powers for most of their money? How can we make it more effective in your thought? What are your thoughts on that?
One of the things I'll have all of you consider is that there is no aspect of your life or work that is not political. There is no aspect of your life or work where someone doesn't wield power, someone isn't making rules. And so when you're talking about an international organization with states, nation states as its members, one of the points I made in my presentation was it's only going to be as strong as the strongest members will allow it to be. And here is a question then that we should ask as Americans or even non-Americans. Would you rather have the United States exercising global leadership in the WHO, or would you rather have China? Great powers create an international order that reflects their values and interests. And so to the extent that we are ceding leadership of these organizations to an authoritarian state, should we be surprised if those values start to get reflected in those international organizations? What is at stake for us? And one of the questions I remember seeing in the chat is, we pay a lot to the WHO, let's just get out. Ask yourself the consequences of such a decision. Would you rather be in the organization with the ability to influence it, or out of the organization with zero ability to influence it?
People say if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Focus on the United States. With the weakening of the EPA in the US, how can we hold companies accountable for their environmental impact?
Yes, interestingly, last Saturday I was running a webinar on outdoor learning, and an EPA person came in and offered some educational materials to help people get connected to the ecosystem. It's difficult. I'm not an American, so any critique is much more difficult for me. However, what I do know is that any guidance, whether it be to countries or companies or corporations, have really interesting limitations. So, for example, looking again at the mining sector, they have something called the International Mine Minerals Institute that kind of overviews and has as its members, all of the CEOs of the top mining corporations involved, and they all sign on to these agreements relating to free, prior and informed consent and Aboriginal rights and land rights and so on. But they admit that they have absolutely no control over their mine managers. And it is mine managers that get the blame for example, the brutalization of Chowpei, as I mentioned earlier, and the damage to the ecosystem. Oh, they didn't do what they were told. And the protocols and ethics guidelines that are offered to those organizations are followed, but within some kind of wonderful excuse. So free, prior and informed consent, for example, in Peru, the mining corporations didn't like that very much because it meant you had to ask the communities what they thought. And they said, no, it's not going to work. It's going to get poisoned, our rivers and everything. So what they did was they took away the rights of free, prior, informed consent from those communities in the Peruvian Andes by changing their status from indigenous to non-indigenous, because free, prior and informed consent only applies to indigenous. So there's interesting ways in which people kind of wiggle out of these things. And the other one I just wanted to add, the other part of this, another student asked about connection with other disciplines. And with a great philosophy class last Monday, and, I wrote a paper with a philosopher about engineering ethics one time, and we actually looked at ethics through the lens of social justice. And we looked at the way that ethicists and engineering ethics people guide through codes of ethics, things like the impact of mining. And it depends very much on your political viewpoint of the time that you're in. So, for example, the greater good, you could imagine, lots of people are going to benefit from the mining. Let's forget about those few people who are going to poison water next to the mine. Forget about them. That doesn't matter, because it's the greater good of, stake shareholders that are going to get all that money. So, of course, we must go ahead. So you can apply that to anything and make it work. So I say you have to put through a social justice lens if you want equity. Ethics can somehow sneak through political gaps.
This was a really beautiful way to wrap up these 5 weeks. It has been an absolute pleasure to kind of guide you through this and to have kind of this wrap up in terms of social justice and our interconnectivity.